Further amendments on this portion of the mark? Gentleman from Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have the amendment on the computer.
And if the clerk will press send or whatever it is y'all do, without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman from Rhode Island is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The amendment that I offer today that has the co-sponsorship of every one of my Democratic colleagues on the House Armed Services Committee will recognize that climate security is a fundamental part of our national security strategy. And we've studied a number of vectors for readiness on this committee, and but we often overlook this major multifaceted threat. Climate change, as we know, is real, and it can affect our readiness both tactically and strategically. We know this because current and former military leaders agree. Secretary Mattis was correct when he stated, and I quote, "The effects of a changing such as increased maritime access to the Arctic, rising sea levels, desertification, among others, will impact our security situation," end quote. And, Mr. Chairman, I have a letter here from Admiral Stavridis who has spoken out on this issue, and it supports this amendment, and I'd like to enter that for the record if I could.
Without objection.
So, Mr. Chairman, naval bases such as Norfolk or Key West are already at risk for flooding, and that's just going to get worse as storm surges and rising tides increase in magnitude. So inland bases will experience other weather volatility such as extreme heat and wildfires, all of which can and do, in fact, impact their training capabilities. So thinking strategically, the changing climate will totally alter our joint battle space. So we've already seen display of dominance in the Arctic, where new sea lanes will connect continents more directly than ever before. Russia and other world powers recognize the value of this area, and we must be ready. So moreover, the changing global climate will lead to increased instability in the form of economic migration, increased competition over resources, and possibly more failed states, which we know to be breeding grounds for extremism and terrorism. Now, we know this because the leaders of the intelligence community as well have alerted us to this fact. They recognize that climate is a long-term threat, and we should as well. So my amendment is straightforward and simple. It instructs each service to assess the top 10 military installations likely to be impacted by climate change over the next 20 years. We ask for combatant commanders to incorporate the effects of climate into their strategic battle plans. This amendment, Mr. Chairman, is a step in the right direction. I believe that we have to continue to be realistic and to explore the changing ways that a volatile climate will threaten the Department's mission. The truth is that the Department can study this on their own, as they have a wide berth when it comes to assessing threats to national security. But this amendment shows that Congress has the Department's back. It signals that we are not naive to the dangers of climate change or defense strategy, and it tells those researchers on the front lines of threat assessment that Congress will work with them, not in spite of them, as we together craft a sane and sober strategy to defend the United States from a variety of threats. So I believe that we absolutely have to ensure that the Department remains resilient and is prepared to address the effects of climate change on threat assessments, resources, and readiness, as well as to conduct operations both today and in the future. So with that, I want to thank all of my Democratic colleagues for their support of and co-sponsorship of my amendment. I welcome the support and the comments of all of the members of the committee on this topic, and I urge everyone today to support its passage. And with that, I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Mr. McEachin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, in Hampton Roads, Virginia, recurrent flooding is already, sadly, a fact of life. Sea level rise poses an existential threat to communities right outside of my district and to those bases the communities contain. If anyone doubts me, I invite you to come down and visit our region. Local officials from both cities will gladly explain to you how much is at stake. In the Chesapeake Bay, Tangier Island is slowly disappearing. The city of Norfolk needs more than $1 billion to cope with just 1 foot of sea level rise, and scientists expect far larger increases than that. As everyone in this room knows, the entire Hampton Roads region is littered with military bases. Many of the most critical sit right on the coast, notably Naval Station Norfolk, Joint Base Langley Eustis, and Naval Air Station Oceanor's Dam Neck Annex. Sea level rise endangers all of these installations. And again, rising waters are a fact of life in Hampton Roads. Over the last 80 years, the waters at Naval Station Norfolk have climbed more than 14 inches and counting. It is inconceivable to me that this committee would not want to better understand this looming threat and would want to take proactive steps to address it. Delay will affect capability and readiness at these coastal installations, eventually destroying the value of investments we've made over many decades. This amendment would give us a clearer picture of the exact challenges we face. It would require the Department of Defense to lay out potential solutions, giving us a roadmap for how to meet those challenges. In short, it would move us from passivity to active participation. Our military plans and trains every day for wars that, God willing, we'll never have to fight. We should prepare with equal vigor for the threats that we actually know we have to face. I thank my friend, the gentleman from Rhode Island, for his leadership on this issue. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Ms. Tsongas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am a co-sponsor of this amendment and strongly support its passage. Scientists tell us that climate change is real, is caused by human activity, and could have devastating effects across the globe.
Thank you.
It is a very real crisis. If left untouched, will cause irreparable harm to current and future generations. Our military leaders, Secretary of Defense Mattis, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Dunford, former Secretary of Defense Gates, have all testified to the risks that climate change poses to military readiness and our national security. This amendment is a common-sense addition to the National Defense Authorization Act. I thank Representative Langevin for his leadership, and I urge a yes vote. And with that, I yield back.
Ms. Rosen.
Thank you. I want to say that we can debate the causes of climate change all day long, but nonetheless, climate change that challenges us to deal with the current and future issues that we have. The DoD must pay attention to the adverse potential effects of climate change, and as Secretary Mattis said, it really impacts us in the food and water in all of our agriculture areas. It's how it drives instability in the Middle East. The melting of the Arctic will thaw Russian ports. It will clear those northern sea lanes and drive increased resource extraction activity. And we also have to consider plans to respond to climate-driven disasters and the instability that they cause. As the weather gets warmer, droughts and famine will create more failed states. Former Secretary of the Air Force Deborah Lee James said in an interview, failed states are the natural breeding ground for terrorists. More countries, including our own, can be hit by droughts and famines. Governments can be destabilized and can pave the ways for the rise of dictators and dissolution of countries into lawless regions, similar to what we have in ISIS. What I want to say is that water really affects our agriculture here at home in very important ways. We can live without, but we can't live without a safe, secure water grid. That means safe, secure drinking water and safe, secure farming within our borders. And if we don't also have that globally, we will have a worldwide crisis. For those reasons and so many more, I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. I yield back.
Mr. Carbajal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this should not be a partisan issue. The risks are too high. It is not just our oceans and ecosystems at risk, but our nation's security. Climate change is impacting all parts of the world in different ways, And as a military that has committed, we must be prepared to protect our personnel and assets from the impacts of climate change. And this amendment does exactly that. In 2008, the National Intelligence Council found that over 30 military sites in the continental U.S. are already facing elevated risks because of sea level rise. In the western United States, drought has amplified the threat of wildfires, and floods have damaged roads, runways, and buildings on military bases. Last year in California, fires threatened Camp Pendleton as well as Vandenberg Air Force Base in my district. A year's worth of rain fell in 80 minutes at Fort Irwin in the Mojave Desert in California, causing $64 million in damage. There's no question climate change will increasingly impact our nation's military infrastructure here and abroad, ultimately making it more difficult to defend America's interests. Climate change will continue to pose a threat for the American people and the health of this nation. We must make the necessary investments to address climate change, as its impacts will increasingly disrupt our ability to carry out critical missions in defense of our country. And this amendment will not only help us further identify weaknesses and vulnerabilities, but also investments we must make within the department to protect it from the impacts of climate change. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Let's see, Mr. O'Halloran, did you want to? Okay, Ms. Bardallo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have heard from many senior officials that climate change is a national security issue. The report directed in this amendment will help to define the risks to our installations and identify potential mitigation efforts in the future. Climate change threatens our installations, particularly coastal installations where rising sea levels and threats of tidal flooding raise serious concerns. I certainly wouldn't want Guam to disappear. Our recent study noted that tidal flooding events have increased fourfold since 1970, and conservative estimates forecast an increase of tenfold over the next 35 years. So climate change is holding many of our facilities at risk today, and this report will clearly detail which installations are at risk and potential mitigation efforts. So I urge my colleagues to vote yes on Mr. Langevin's fact-finding amendment, and I yield back.
Chairman Bishop.
Mr. Chairman, I guess I am first grateful that we are no longer using paper. We're doing this electronically, because 4 of the 6 pages is rhetoric on this particular issue before you actually get to the report language. We would have cut down a lot of trees had we been passing out paper. But there is a line in the play 1776 about the Declaration of Independence, when Stephen Hopkins of Rhode Island was also quoted as saying, "I have neither seen, heard, nor smelled an issue so dangerous it couldn't be talked about. Hell yes, I'm for debating anything." Whether the first 4 pages in here are accurate or not, there's nothing dangerous about talking about it. This asks for a report. I'll support the idea of having a report. I'll yield back.
I want to associate myself with Mr. Bishop's comments. Thank you.
Ms. Davis.
Thank you. I'll do the same, but I just wanted to point out that this is really a start. It wasn't an effort to look at the vulnerabilities across our military installations all over the world, but it was to select the top 10. And I think that's why this is a good start. It will be looking at mitigations as well. This is one of those issues that is sort of in that bucket that we ignore at our peril. And so moving forward, beginning this discussion we look at our installations is a worthwhile thing to do, and I appreciate my colleagues saying that.
Ms. Cheney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hate to disagree with Chairman Bishop, but I'm going to. I oppose this amendment strongly. We have heard testimony in front of this committee consistently about the array of imminent threats we face, about the extent to which the Russians, the Chinese, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Iran, North Korea are presenting, in some cases, imminent threats to us as a nation. And as these threats have grown, our own capabilities have diminished. We face a situation today in which our adversaries are developing weapon systems against which we may not be able to defend ourselves. And there is simply no way that you can argue that climate change is one of those threats. It's not even close. At a time of significant resource constraints, we simply cannot afford to instruct the Department of Defense to take their eye off the ball. There is no evidence that climate change causes war. If you look at the refugee flows that are often cited, for example, the refugee flows across Syria and Iraq are the greatest today. People are not leaving their homes because they're too hot. They're leaving their homes to escape ISIS and the regime. North Korea is not developing nuclear-tipped ICBMs because the climate's changing. Russia's not engaging in increasingly aggressive behavior against its neighbors and threatening NATO because it's too hot. ISIS and al-Qaeda aren't attacking the West because of the weather. At this moment of crisis for our military, particularly in the area of readiness, we on this committee have an obligation to do everything we can to begin to dig out of the hole we're in and to ensure maximum lethality for our forces. Declaring that climate change requires additional reporting from the Department of Defense makes that more, not less, difficult. We have to face our responsibilities and the threats with a clear-eyed determination, and I believe we should take steps on this committee that make it more possible for us to build the military that we all know we need to begin to rebuild. We shouldn't take steps that impose additional requirements based on political issues, and in my view, that's exactly what this one is. We have an obligation, in my view, to vote against this amendment and to ensure that we provide the resources our military needs to keep their eye on the ball, which is an array of complex and critical and in some cases imminent threats to the security of the nation, and climate change is not one of those. I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment, and I yield back.
That's a little afraid of. Ms. Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm speaking in support of this amendment. When I was at the Department of Defense more than a decade ago, conversations about climate change's impact on our national security were already being had, and they were being had at the service staff level, at the combatant commands, and in OSD policy. And for a number of years, Secretaries of Defense of Republican and Democratic administrations alike, and numerous other uniformed defense leaders have identified climate change as a challenge to national security. In fact, Secretary Mattis has acknowledged that the effects of climate change, such as increased maritime access to the Arctic, rising sea levels, desertification, and among others, impact our security situation. This amendment simply requires the assessment and report on the vulnerabilities to military installations and combatant commander requirements, things that they're already talking about over in the department. The department and Congress need to understand these impacts and integrate the responses in plans and in resourcing activities. I think we should value fact-based decision-making, and the effects of climate change are something that we deal with on a daily basis in Florida, and it has an effect on our economy and our way of life. So we can no more deny climate change's impact on our life in our state than we can deny its impact on our national security. So I think that I would request the support of my colleagues for this amendment. I yield back.
Mr. Garamendi.
One could debate whether climate change is real or not. I think that's a debate that we don't need to get into, but to suggest that there is no connection between the changing climate and its effects on wars is incorrect. There are major conflicts now underway in areas where America has troops. You might take a look at the Hindu Kush Mountains, the Indus River. India and Pakistan are having a bit of a discussion about dams on the Indus River and the reduction in flows of that river as a result of change and the receding glaciers. Similar effects are occurring in the great rivers of China as a result of climate change and the recession of receding glaciers. You might want to take a look at the great Mekong River and the countries that are along and through which the Mekong River flows, and look at the debates that are going on now and the conflicts, not yet wars, but could become. And you only need to look at the environmental impacts of climate change with regard to food production to suggest that there is no relationship between food production or the lack of production and wars is long before or shortly before there was a civil war in Syria, there was a serious reduction in agricultural production on two great river systems in that region, in part as a result of climate change and certainly in part as a result of overuse of the aquifers in the area. You may want to consider Turkey's relationship with Syria and Iraq with regard to the rivers in that area. In fact, climate change does directly relate to war. Yield back.
Mr. Bridenstine.
Just like to make a quick comment here associating myself with Mr. Bishop. I think it's important to note on this particular issue, there are real changes in the Arctic that do affect the Navy. The Arctic ice is disappearing. There's strategic changes that are being implicated here. And it's important for the Department of Defense to report to Congress on this. We're talking about a report here. And I would just like to associate myself with Mr. Bishop on this issue. It's just a report, and there are strategic implications that we need to be.
Ms. Shea Porter.
Thank you. I have to say that I live in a coastal state, and I think it's a very nonpartisan issue in New Hampshire that people recognize the impact that it's having. We do have streets that have water in them in the middle of the sunshine days, and we also have some installations, military installations, that are looking at this. This is a very real threat. And it isn't just Congress, although it is Congress's responsibility to do something about this, and I appreciate the fact that we're talking about a report. But Vice Admiral Lee Gunn, U.S. Navy retired, said, "The national security community is rightly worried about climate change because of the magnitude of its expected impacts around the globe, even in our own country. Climate change poses a clear and present danger to the United States of America. But if we respond appropriately, I believe we will enhance our security, not simply by averting the worst climate change impacts, but by spurring a new energy revolution." Those words give me hope, and I think we are responding appropriately. I urge my colleagues to vote yes. I yield back.
Concluding comments from Mr. Lamborn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have a quick question for the sponsor of the amendment for clarification purposes. On page 3, paragraph 8 says a 3-foot rise in sea levels will threaten the operations of more than 128 United States military sites. And the study that's called for at the end of the amendment says to DOD to look at threats within the next 20 years. So are you saying or predicting that there's going to be a 3-foot rise in the ocean in the next 20 years?
I'm not sure of the time frame for when that is, but that would be an assessment that DOD could include as they assess over the next 20 years what areas and what bases would be most affected within that time frame. I don't want to prejudge the data that they would use to make that calculation. I want this to be science-based and let them come to that determination and then look to what mitigating factors steps they would take in the event of what they anticipate based on science, what the outcome would need to do to change.
Okay, thank you. Reclaiming my time, I yield back.
Questions on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Langevin. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted.